Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture will cover the definition of determining a species and mechanisms for speciation. We'll first start by taking a look at some of the definitions of species. It's not as clear-cut as you might think. Because it's not so clear, in fact there's quite a bit of gray area, we have multiple species concepts or definitions. We'll start by covering a few of those. Then we'll go ahead and look at some of the factors that actually lead to speciation. Speciation is going to be the process by which a new species is formed by way of evolution. And finally, we'll take a look at some of the methods and issues with determining the correct number of marine mammal species. Take a good look at this picture. You might note, hey, here's a picture of 5 different species. And you can kind of tell that because they look pretty different from each other. But what happens when I show you a picture of 2 individuals that are pretty closely aligned in appearance? In other words, they look like they might be the same species, or not. Maybe they're just closely related. How can you tell? Where do you draw the line that says these are 2 different species or they're the same species? As it turns out, that is a very difficult question to answer. Probably the most commonly applied definition to finding that line is called the biological species concept. In this one, we basically say, let's take 2 individuals from a group, and we're going to say they are the same species if I can take a male here and a female here, mate them, and they can actually produce offspring that themselves can go on and carry on the generations. In other words, the offspring are not sterile. This is referred to as the biological species concept. Where we draw that line and we say they're actually different species is when they can no longer reproduce with each other. When that happens, we call that reproductive isolation. But, as I mentioned before, it's not black and white. There's gray area. And there are truly exceptions to the biological species concept. Let's take a look at 2 of them. In one scenario, you can have 2 individuals that truly do belong to the same species, but cannot mate successfully. In other words, they don't reproduce for a variety of reasons. I'll actually use the common dog, which is Canis familiaris, as an example. Now, most people are familiar with dogs and different dog breeds. And of course, all dog breeds still technically belong to the same species. And you can get different breeds mating with each other. That's, of course, where you get the term mutt from. But let's imagine that we have a really big male dog, such as a boxer, maybe an 80, 90-pound boxer. And we get a little tiny female dog, such as this Bichon Frise here, which maybe can be as small as 10 pounds. And you get that male boxer and that female Bichon Frise together, they're not mating. You can probably guess that anatomically, that male cannot technically impregnate that female. So you've got 2 individuals belonging to the same species, and they can't mate successfully. Alternatively, you can get 2 individuals that definitely do belong to different species, but they can mate successfully. Here we have a picture of the infamous growler, otherwise known as a pizzly. It's actually a hybrid between a polar bear and a grizzly. And of course, if you take a good look at the picture, it's got some of the characteristics of both a polar bear and a grizzly. We know that polar bears and grizzly bears are different species, but it turns out they actually can and apparently do mate and produce offspring successfully. So here's where we get into some of the issue where the biological species concept may not be exactly what we're looking for or easy to apply. Because of this, we've actually come up with some other concepts for determining species. They include the morphological species concept. In the morphological species concept, you basically take a look at species anatomical characteristics, and we say if they're similar enough, we call them the same species. This is especially useful for fossils because clearly the fossils are long gone and are no longer mating, and also for species that don't actually reproduce sexually. But it's not the only alternative concept. Another one is called the ecological species concept. In the ecological species concept, we basically get the idea that we have maybe a species, but they've clearly segregated in what they do. In other words, you get a group over here that's going to do one thing in the ecosystem and a group over here that's going to do a totally different thing. And by the ecological species concept, we break them apart by role, and we draw the line and we say, this group clearly does nothing like this group, they're different species, even if they look really similar. An example that's currently on the table is going to be orcas. Orcas actually break down into different ecological subtypes, where you have a group that will just prey on fish, and a group that preys on warm-blooded prey like seals and other marine mammals. They do very different things, even though they actually might coexist. Are they the same species or different species? The jury's still out on that one. All right, now that we've actually looked at some of the species concepts, let's take a look at how new species are formed. This process is called speciation. It basically says I'm going to take a group and I'm going to actually separate them so they do truly form new species. In order to do that, what we have to do is basically break apart two groups and prevent them from breeding with each other. In other words, we need to limit the gene flow from this group to this group and back again. As we do that, they will evolve in different directions, as shown here with the butterflies. We start with what's called parent population, that's down at the bottom, and through generations they evolve to be more different and more different and more different until you get to the top where you say, clearly, those two butterflies at the very top of this picture are going to be different species. But they evolved from the same parent. They just evolved in different directions. So the key here is that speciation actually has to start from limiting gene flow between populations. So how does that happen? Well, probably the most common way this happens is by actually physically separating the populations. You say, here's a big population, I'm going to divide you and move one set over here and one set over here, such that no individuals are immigrating or emigrating between those populations. That limits gene flow. Over time, we expect them to evolve differently as they adapt to their environments. Now, that type of speciation is called allopatric speciation, and it involves a physical separation. For marine mammals, even though we're still dealing with water, there are those physical separations. They happen across oceans. The Atlantic Ocean versus the Pacific Ocean, for example, is separated by the America continents. That's a huge allopatric speciation mechanism. Another one that may not be quite as obvious is actually using the equator, which separates the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere. Many marine mammals that prefer cold waters do not cross the equator. And so as a result, you'll get northern species and southern species in the same ocean, but separated into different hemispheres. This also is an example of allopatric speciation. So as an example, we have the northern elephant seals and the southern elephant seals. They're different species separated by the equator. That's not the only way that you can have speciation, though. You can also actually keep the population or the species coexisting, but for whatever reason, the populations have segregated themselves, such that we form individual groups that do not mate with each other. Such a mechanism is called sympatric speciation. And once again, you don't physically separate them, but they choose not to mate with each other. There can be a variety of causes for this. For example, one group could mate during the spring and another group could mate during the fall. That right there is going to limit gene flow between those two populations. Alternatively, you could have one group that just behaviorally chooses not to mate with the other group. So we would call that behavioral isolation. Or it could be anatomical. One group over here maybe doesn't quite have the anatomical fit for this other group over here for successful mating. Who knows? Regardless of the mechanism, we call it sympatric speciation when the species currently coexists or can coexist, but chooses not to mate with each other for whatever the reason. This is probably what we're seeing with those orcas that I just mentioned, where one group is feeding predominantly on fish and the other group is feeding predominantly on warm-blooded prey like marine mammals. we don't seem to think that they're breeding across their groups or population. So even though they're found in the same waters and from an ecological standpoint they fill different roles, they're also probably not breeding. So given enough time, we would expect them to actually morph into truly different species by the biological species concept. Okay, determining marine mammal species has actually been really difficult, in part because the biological species concept is difficult to apply. If you say, hey, I want to know if these two whales are the same species, and you get a male whale over here and a female whale over here, and you want to see if they mate, good luck with that. It's not going to be something you can control. So historically, the morphological species approach has been applied where people have used skull anatomy from a type specimen and then compared the skull. But unfortunately, this probably actually belies or undershoots the true diversity of marine mammal species. And since much of our research efforts are focused on conserving marine mammals, and to correctly conserve them, we need to know how many species there are, we really need a better mechanism to determine how many marine mammal species there are. As a result, in the last decade or so, there's come about more of a comprehensive approach that basically says, let's take a look at different types of data and see if we can integrate them with the skull anatomy to really determine the correct number of species. So what types of data am I talking about? Well, for starters, there's been a huge boom in genetic data. Genetic data basically looks at the DNA sequence of a particular individual or a population and starts comparing them. And what we're really looking for is maybe we get a group such as the orcas that look maybe like they could mate, maybe they do, but maybe their genetic data actually says they're totally different. In other words, the DNA sequence of one group is pretty different than the other. That's strong evidence that you have limited gene flow without actually watching reproduction happen. Another piece of information that's more commonly being integrated is called morphometric data. Morphometric data basically takes a look at other pieces of information on living individuals, such as their total size, their fin shape, their coloration. Those are all examples of morphological traits that have a genetic component to them, and metric means that you're looking at measurement, so total size. If you get an orca group that tends to be twice as large as the other orca group, that's pretty strong evidence that they're not breeding with each other. Again, new integration beyond skull anatomy. And then finally, we have some other pieces of data that actually offer, at the very least, supportive evidence. One is to look at the geographical range. If you have something that's currently called one species, but you have fragmented populations, whereas one population, for example, is in the northern hemisphere, one's in the southern hemisphere, and there's no way they're mating, that's pretty strong evidence that if they haven't speciated yet, they will soon. And finally, behavior. Don't discount behavior because marine mammals exhibit a lot of behavior and mate choice. And if you get individuals that are showing behaviors that are drastically different than other individuals within the same species, that's a good clue that maybe they're not going to be mating and we're going to see that reproductive isolation. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.